Hey, hello. Thanks for joining. This session is on resiliency, specifically building the business case for resiliency and making sure that we get those outcomes above and beyond making things available. My name is Wolfgang Gorlick. I am an advisory CISO for Dual Security, part of Cisco. But before that, I've done a lot in continuity, way back to when you had to restore from tapes. I've done a fair bit in incident response, way back from when good security was a firewall, maybe, and an antivirus. And for many years, I was doing consulting. Right, I was, hey, let's put together a plan for you. Let's go ahead and run some tests, and helped organizations get ready for example, pandemic planning. So as you might imagine, when 2020 rolled around, I reached out and I was like, hey, how's it going? Right? I remember that plan we wrote. Remember that pandemic exercise we did. Remember that time where we set up a strategy for working from home. How did that go? And I really hoped, maybe naively, I've been accused of being naive. I really hoped that people are like, oh man, this saved us. We're so ready. We're so prepared. I really hoped that would hear, oh yeah, we followed that document and we're right up and operational. But even organizations where I'd run literal pandemic tabletop exercises using the CDC kit toolkit for zombie preparedness, which, by the way, if you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. Even with organizations that did that, a lot of them didn't realize the outcomes that we had hoped. And so in this talk, I'm going to share a couple different organizations. I'm going to share a couple different business cases to highlight how to make the business cases. I'm going to highlight where people are going wrong, especially in not getting the outcomes we want, but also my team looked at hundreds of business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, incident response plans. I want to boil down some of those lessons learned for you. So after you make the business case, you can avoid some common mistakes, and then talk about how to drive downstream outcomes from a good resiliency business case. It is really important that I give some context here. I am going to be talking about recovery and continuity. I'm going to be talking about incident response. I'm going to be talking about good problem management. I'm going to be talking about this in the context of making our technology more resilient. Why? So that our business can operate, so our organization can run key processes, so we can execute on our strategy. What this talk is not is organizational resilience, supply chain resilience, personal resilience. Those are incredibly important topics, well worth discussing here at RSA. But for scoping purposes, we're going to be focused in more on the IT side as we go forward. Another key thing to point out is that the stories you're about to hear are based on true events. These three case studies are composites that are typical of what are in the market today. These are not representative of any particular organization, environment, friend, client, someone in the audience. I'm not talking about you, but these are all things that I've brought into three composite case studies. With that, let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about a financial services organization. This financial services organization is a money management firm. It's trading on the open markets. And when we first encounter this organization, we find a couple different things. One, we find their continuity plan is a culture. Needless to say, communication plans are important. However, having a communication plan and a culture in such a document that's maintained separate of anything else, always a risk. Why? Because people come and people go, people change, the numbers change. And now we're maintaining things in multiple different places. Also, again, if it's just a call tree, we're probably in a bad spot. One of the reasons it's just a call tree is that there's an operations manager, really gung-ho, great heart, great spirit, who has been named as the business continuity and disaster recovery manager. Now, You may wonder if that's the right level for this type of resilience. We'll get back to that. And the third component of where they're at is that they're testing, their exercise, their attestation that our plan works is an annual fire drill. Really important to do a fire drill. It's great to empty out the building. Probably does not speak to the ability to keep technology running in a major outage. Probably does not speak to the ability to recover to something like a pandemic. Right? There's a lot of scenarios that are missing here. And the triggering point, the precipitating event, is an audit finding. Third-party audit looks at their plan, says, you know what, this does not meet SEC requirements. We need to address this. So when we think about building a business case, there's really four main components. There's the strategic context, and we discussed that. There's an audit finding we need to think about. High availability is important for a financial services firm. From a money management perspective, we can figure out what happens when we're down, especially if the market's moving, especially if there's a high trading day. And that gets into the second part of the business case, which is the financials. How are we going to justify any improvement? In this case, audit is a pretty big lever. However, you'll find that the compliance business case is oftentimes the quickest to fund, but the hardest to fully fund. Because from an audit perspective, a compliance perspective, we're not protecting revenue, we're not generating revenue. It's not an area where people such as the CFO are going to be inclined to fund. So we've got a hot business case, but a business case that may be limited in terms of funding. Some other ways that we could justify some funding is, hey, how much money is on the table? How much money do we stand to lose if we're down for a period of time? And then, traditional security math, right? We got this much money, we're spending that to protect it. There's your business case. The third component of a business case is your stakeholders. Here we got internal audit and external audit, of course. The CFO is going to be involved, the CIO in terms of making sure technology is up and operational. The COO currently owns this from the perspective of being an operations function. We're going to want to get the CISO involved. And then finally, we get the management approach. What are they going to do in terms of addressing and setting up this capability? I would argue that we need to move this under the CISO. There's also a good discussion that can be had about what does it say to have this capability at an operational level and a project manager level. It probably says that continuity, recovery, and response is not thought of as an executive issue, definitely not thought of as a board level issue. It may point to some friction between the business and the technology stack. We'll want to delve into that as we put together the business case. And it probably means that the way that managing risks is divorced from the technology risks. So those are our main ways that we're going to go at this business case. We're going to justify it in terms of closing an audit gap. We're going to find some budget in terms of avoiding downtime, and we're going to move forward. Now, this particular client organization has a CFO who's like, look, what we got to do is make sure that we can withstand an asteroid. If an asteroid slams into the ground, I want to know that we can keep on the market. I want to know that we can resume. The asteroid scenario, everything's flattened. Great scenario to build for. Does leave you with some open questions, right? Such as, what happens if the building is still available? What happens if the technology is still available? What about all these different scenarios? Should we just build for the asteroid, or should we also build for little meteorites? What happens about the zombies? Have we considered the zombies? In the next level, once we got the business case in place and we've got funding to move forward, what we need to start thinking about is how we're going to take all the potential disaster scenarios, map them to a few high-level scenarios, building outage for a period of time, people working remote for a period of time, power technology loss for a period of time, and then map those back to what we're going to do to protect that technology stack. with an eye towards the CFO, with an eye towards making sure that this is budget friendly, especially given this is a compliance business case, we're going to make sure that we are really prioritizing the IT assets that are driving most of the value to the business, right? So in this firm, this would be IT assets for money management, for trading, for reconciliation, those sort of things. Prioritizing on those will allow us to better align our recovery strategies with what matters to the business. Now let's talk a little bit about other outcomes besides just keeping the lights on when the asteroid hits. Throughout this talk, I'm going to reference several times a report that Scientia did with Cisco called the Security Outcome Study. What they did was they looked at close to 5,000 respondents and asked them a very key question that we always want to know. What are you doing and what outcomes are you getting? What outcomes are you getting and what tasks are you performing? Because there's a lot of different tasks that we can perform, including disaster recovery and continuity, as I just was discussing. And then we figured out what correlates by how much. So what Scientia found, one of the many things, is that organizations that had good continuity and recovery were much more likely to gain the confidence of the executive leadership. My hypothesis there is it's better to have that conversation of we're doing this with this asset to protect trading than it is to say, oh yeah, there's a server that could go down. or in AWS, we've got some issues with some of our instances, right? It's better to be talking about what matters to the organization. And I believe that's one of the reasons why we see this outcome. Likewise, another outcome that's oftentimes seen is the ability to keep up with the business. Again, I believe that ties back to understanding what any piece of technology means within context of the organization. A light bulb moment went off in this process. So you got your business case, we've set up our scenarios and strategies, we're implementing the technology, and a light bulb moment went off for me when I realized that if we are prioritizing IT assets, if we're doing a business impact analysis, if we're doing those sort of things, that gives us great insight intelligence that can flow down into our SIEM, that can flow down into our vulnerability management program. That gives us some really good ways to say, hey, this particular asset that just had an alert probably doesn't matter because it's not tied to a key process. Or red alert, that should be thoroughly investigated. Why? Because that is on the direct path towards trading, which again is how this organization makes money. So using BIA to drive prioritization, using prioritization to drive other risk management functions. And not too surprisingly, the Scientia study also found that organizations who had very effective recovery and continuity programs were also much more likely to identify and manage top risks. Again, I would argue that's because they've got the context of how those risks matter and play out in the organization. So that is continuity, recovery, and resilience. Let's talk about the next business case, which will get us more into incident response. And this particular business case, what we're looking at is a software as a service organization. Their starting point is, hey, plan? What plan? We don't need continuity when we're distributed high environment where everything is just failing over and automatically spun up and spun down, and DevOps is awesome. DevOps is awesome. However, we do still need to think about resiliency in here. The primary business driver is customer acquisition, getting new customers, retaining customers. As you might imagine, downtime is directly correlated with losing customers and losing deals. So the CISO is very focused on uptime and is very focused on code level security, making sure that the product is very secure. It's a great place to be. However, as you might imagine, that's a little bit in the weeds considering all the other impacts the organization might face. So for example, you can have a completely pristine code base and still have features and functionality that allow an adversary to misuse your product. You can have a completely pristine code base and still not have enough resiliency on the back end so that you have an outage. And that ends the precipitating event. An outage occurs, and now we have a conversation about continuity and recovery. When making this business case, again, we're going to think about those four things, right? What's the strategic context? Availability, uptime, crucial for SaaS growth. We may want to, delve into any unplanned work or wasted effort that might be going on. We may want to delve into looking at this not only as availability issue, but also looking at this as an incident response issue. So responding to outages and responding to attacks. So broadly, that's the context. Financially, we're driving this with customer retention. One of my favorite ways of making a business case, by the way, because we're able to speak to reliability, we're able to speak to availability, and we're able to tie that down to incoming revenue and customer retention, which can provide us the pool of money to invest in a recovery scenario. Key stakeholders are the product owners, the DevOps team, and the CISO. And the management approach is going to be viewing this as a resiliency within the DevOps function and a governance within the CISO function. So the CISO will own governance and will set availability and set recovery times and metrics and SLAs. The DevOps team will run to that, but will be predominantly focused in on uptime and good engineering, good SRE, right? Site reliability engineering. A key point here is when we think about peer support and buy-in for security, which organizations that are more resilient are more likely to have. When we think about peer support and buy-in for security, what we need to be thinking about is what's in it for them, right? And good business cases, like the business case we're talking about here with the SaaS, good business cases are satisfying a business need or a team need first. And by doing that, they're providing security as a secondary outcome. I think it's really important for me to say again, just to emphasize, business cases must satisfy the business need first. And by satisfying that business need, provide security as a secondary outcome. Here, what we're looking at is when anything is suspicious, because it's broke or because it potentially is being attacked, go ahead and address that by running some scripts and bringing things back up in a quick way. Which gets to the second point, which is how do we minimize unplanned work? How do we minimize wasted effort? Well, we do that with automation. We do that with automated scripts. So if the environment looks weird and we're like, hey, that should be happening. Why is that box running that service and calling out to those IP addresses that are on our known bad list? Why are things coming in from Tor? When things weird are happening, right? Take action. How do we take action? We run an Ansible script, we reload an instance, we push things out to a known good environment, we roll back and then roll forward with whatever security controls and new functionality we need to. So business cases that satisfy that business need through automation, those business cases have an outcome of minimizing wasted work and wasting effort. The light bulb moment for me with this particular business case, so you have the business case of high availability. You go ahead and map out your scenarios. Well, things could be broken, things could be attacked. There could be a disruption in our down services, or there could be disruption in the cloud. You map those out and you come up with some recovery scenarios. We're going to do this, that, and the other. And we're going to do those in an automated fashion. The insight that I had here was that high availability, specifically around the DevOps model, high availability leads to high security. So if you've had the opportunity to see some, say, Sunil use DIE concepts, that's exactly what I'm talking about, right? Distributed, immutable, ephemeral infrastructure. If we've got a distributed environment, we can lose multiple nodes without having an impact. If we got an ephemeral environment, we can have multiple nodes compromised and wipe those, reload those without losing any data and without missing a beat. The key point here is that if we can erase and rebuild the environment faster than the adversary can break in and stage tools environment, we win, right? Security wins. And that's exactly what happened after they had this business case and they implemented these scenarios. There was a zero-day exploit, not in the code, right? Our code's good. Zero-day exploit and some of the underlying systems. That zero-day exploit allowed the adversaries to get in and stage tools. So they got in for the first layer, started staging their tools. Think about what an adversary is going to do next. They're going to try and move laterally, right? They're going to scan, figure out where else they can pivot to. And as they scan and pivot, that is being picked up, right? It's being picked up on the network level. That's weird. We don't usually see that. It's being picked up on the host level. That's weird. We don't usually see that. It's being picked up on the API level, especially if you got like a good service spec that enforces like a YAML file. Oh, if you call, and I'm expecting $1 and you're sending me a whole bunch of strings, probably something weird. So it gets detected by the capability the organization put in place for resilience. What happens? Automated response. Kill that node, reload it with an Ansible script. Good. Now it's still vulnerable. We're not patching. It's a zero-day exploit. So that instance is still vulnerable. The adversaries are out. Now they may notice they're out and break back in. Okay. But the minute they go to scan or move forward again, what happens? It's detected, they're wiped, they're erased. And it's that concept of using high availability, using resiliency to drive IR, which is fascinating to me. If that happens a few times, obviously we want to get the IR team in place. We want to do some investigation. If it happens once or twice, maybe it's simply a outage. Let the SRE team use it and look at it. But the underlying concept here is high availability and rapid response as a way to mitigate incident response and get ahead of things and prevent the criminals from moving forward into our environment, stopping them at the front gate with a set of technology that's predominantly driving the business value for the DevOps team and secondarily providing a security benefit. So with that, now that we've looked at how IR can tie into this resiliency case, being automated using scripts, let's talk a little bit about the third business case. And this one's in manufacturing. So here we got a manufacturer, and they've got a few things going on. Bit of an out-of-date business continuity plan, a good continuity plan, but not one that's necessarily aligned with standards. Someone clearly took their CSSP example and went, I can write this. Okay, it's good. There are some parts in the disaster recovery level that are very good. So plant level recovery, if an asteroid hits or more likely a hurricane, they can recover and move things over, no problem. However, if it's something in back office technology, we're going to have other issues. And then within the back office technology, we find there's a significant amount of applications, 1,000,001 apps. Everyone's been provisioning applications. We don't necessarily know what all these services do. We don't necessarily know what they all mean. We also know on the horizon that there's a budget coming up for a network refresh. And the precipitating event here is a customer demand. One of their main customers comes to them and says, we want to see your plan and we want you to get a certification so that we can continue to do business with you. So the strategic context here is they need to meet this customer demand. They need to address the customer need. They need to achieve, let's say, TSAC certification so that they can accomplish this. Financials, of course, are going to be based on customer revenue. My favorite way, obviously, to build a security business case, because when we're tied directly to real revenue, we're tied directly, especially if it's a major customer who's making up a significant amount of the revenue, you've got a lot more headroom to build a good recovery strategy. And of course, you've got a lot more momentum behind you from the sales leadership and everything. So our key stakeholders will be sales leadership, plan operations, and the CISO. Management approach is going to be the continuity recovery program under the CISO, but the network program, the technology implementation under the CIO, being overseen by plan operations. And some additional aspects we need to consider. Obviously, they're in manufacturing, so cost is always an issue. We want this to be very cost effective, especially if we can find additional cost savings out of implementing this. And needless to say, we want to make sure that this level of technology addresses the failover scenarios we're concerned with and keeps things up and operational. So in this business case, in moving forward into the next step with implementation, one of the key things is doing a business impact analysis. Now, a business case should have a focus on the primary business need, right? The customer, and then by satisfying that need, as a secondary outcome, increase security. So satisfy the customer, increase the security across the environment. However, we also need to think about additional secondary outcomes that the business case can have. What additional ways can move forward with this have in terms of benefits for the organization? And in this case, what it was the BIA, the business impact analysis, when we did the application inventory, when we look at what these services are doing, what they mean in context of a business process, what they mean in context of the business strategic intent. When we look at those things, we found a lot of redundancies. We found a lot of opportunities for consolidation. We found a lot of opportunities for cost reduction. So not only are we delivering this main benefit of keeping things up, but we're also delivering a second benefit of providing an inventory that allows for a cost reduction program to move forward. Incredibly important. As well as doing the original thing was give us a standardized plan that's easier to audit and easier to defend. We find that according to the Scientia study, again, that organizations that do have continuity and recovery programs, strong resiliency programs, are more likely to be run cost effectively. I suspect, again, it's because of that additional context. And I suspect if you want to achieve that outcome, what you need to do is when you're building your business case, make sure that as a secondary outcome, it is providing insight into where cost savings may exist. Now, this particular organization follows this plan, has a business case, implements it as part of a network refresh. So we're not necessarily having to create a new funding source. As part of a network refresh, implement some of the recovery strategy that's identified in that plan. So when we're implementing it, owned by the CIO and plant operations, that technology or that budget funds the technology stack refresh and funds the recovery structure. The way that they go about this is effectively segmenting off the key lines for that key customer, adding telemetry and monitoring to those lines, making sure that if anything happens, that it's detected, and if anything's suspicious, that connection is shut down. Very similar to the SaaS app, but instead of going ahead and shooting an instance in the head and reloading it and refreshing it, in this case, what we're doing is when something's suspicious, they're simply stopping that network connection and isolating that rogue IP address. So that all gets done. Fast forward 6 months, malware outbreak, right? Malware outbreak, fast moving worm. They're infecting a whole bunch of boxes. And as you know, in manufacturing, it's very common that we've got equipment stretching back to the late 90s, early aughts, Windows XP boxes galore, serial, connections and everything else, right? The good old days, So this malware is moving from host to host to host to host. Every time it touches one of these lines that have recently been redone, are instrumented for resiliency, and are also instrumented with recovery strategies. Every time it touches one of those lines, of course, the line sees that traffic. It's suspicious traffic. We're not supposed to be scanning, trying to connect to us over these protocols, and it would block that backend IP address. Great example of resiliency leading to better security. Also, what I thought was really interesting, and the light bulb moment for me was, not only was that useful in preventing the breach, however, in the incident response, the incident responders got involved, looked at those logs, looked at the traffic sources, and used those secured lines as effectively another source of intel to figure out where the infections were coming from. Reconciling with their asset inventory, tracing down the boxes, but using those lines as one more feed to figure out what was going on in their environment, right? Using them as a detective control. Really interesting way to view a system in a business case that started off with, we need to save this customer, we need to do right by them. So not surprisingly, from the Scientia perspective, they found that organizations with good resilience are more likely to avoid major security issues and incidents. As part of this, also feeding into problem management with good intel and good insight. All right, let's talk next about where things go wrong. My team read 176 business continuity plans, so you don't have to. I almost feel like I should feed them to a bot. Like, those, we fed a million plans to a bot, and it wrote our plan. Actually, now that I think about it, I think I read the plans written by a bot. Here's some of the ways that organizations who have a good business case and good intentions fail to capture some of the benefit of these business cases. Top 3 failures. 1 is the wrong person. I talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Giving the BC role to someone who's in operations. But we want to make sure that the person who's in charge of this has the trust, the ability, the budget, the acumen, the staff to actually go ahead and act on these plans and drive them forward over a longer term. Number 2 is the wrong technology, recovery at the wrong level. Oh, we got front-end load balancers. Don't worry about it. Okay, that's great for your front end, but what happens about that database server that is a single instance and not in a recovery zone? Oh, right? Whatever your accepted threat scenarios are, from asteroids to pandemics to cloud outages, whatever those are, you need to make sure that you've got a corresponding technology strategy that's going to address those, and technology that supports and enables that strategy. So that's the second thing we think. And the third thing is, now that we've got this great recovery strategy, let's test it. We see a lot of times that the goals for testings are wrong. People are testing things that don't apply. They're running a fire test instead of testing when a data center is out. They're testing working from home instead of testing what happens when our cloud has an outage. They are the wrong drills. Several other ways things can get mucked up, right? People, oh, it's outsourced. Don't worry about it. The cloud provider handles it all. Remember your part in this. Non-standard language. Oh yeah, we've got RTO, RPO, but they're not using the terms the right way. Eesh. That oftentimes goes part and parcel with wrong approach. Again, I'm not saying things have to be ISO 22301 or the NIST standards. They don't have to be. However, as a starting point, you have a greater degree of success if you start with a standard compliant approach. Oh, it's high availability. Don't worry about it. We got our servers in HA zones. Okay, but does that cover all your recovery scenarios? And does that cover all your threat scenarios? Overly broad plans. Well, did I mention we got a cloud provider that handles everything? We're all good. Or the opposite is overly specific plans. I tend to think about this as the black swan versus the unnamed goose. The black swan event occurs. We address for that. Awesome. But we also want to make sure that whatever else comes that's bird-shaped, we're prepared for. And then finally, handle these in isolation. I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. When we think about integrating these things with other aspects of security, there's several steps to do. The first part is knowing what matters and what to do with it. Critical outcome from resiliency and continuity. We can tie that, the risk ranking, prioritization, asset inventory back to our operations centers. We can give that information to our incident response team, and we can give that information to our GRC team. A surprising outcome from this was that Scientia and Cisco report found that organizations were having greater ease at retaining top talent. And I think that's because we're not wasting time investigating something that we think is a critical asset, only to realize it's some unpatched printer somewhere. We've all had those days where we spend a ton of time on something only to realize it doesn't matter. That's what we want to avoid. There's some additional integration points here. Flowing down that asset prioritization into our SIEM for logging, monitoring, detecting, alerting, and response. Flowing that into our vulnerability management program so we know which patches are most impactful. This piece of technology is running our core process versus this piece of technology is, I don't know, over on that server somewhere, right? Having that visibility. Also, if we know that the technology is critical, we can then begin to say, okay, what does that mean for perhaps a malicious sysadmin? What does that mean for perhaps a compromised privileged user? Probably doesn't mean anything very good. A lot of the resiliency that we talked about is based on, non-human entities, right? An asteroid or a pandemic or malware. But if it is a human entity, the same ideas apply. So flow that down to PIM and PAM. as well as use this to prioritize alerts coming out of DOP, UEBA, and other technologies. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we don't want to separate resiliency from the organization. I'm talking about resiliency as an IT security function, therefore within the domain of cybersecurity, but resiliency affects more than IT and InfoSec. We want to start with the business case for continuity, recovery, and response. Start there, but take care not to separate and isolate it. Now, once you've got those recovery strategies that map back to your scenarios, exercise the heck out of them so that we know they work. You can start with a story and just talk through it. You can do a tabletop. You can do a tabletop and tie it back to standards and tactics. You can tie that into a framework and do a full pull exercise. And you can take this all the way up to doing a full pull exercise and automating that exercise with like a chaos monkey or chaos engineering approach and moving into continuous improvement. We're not going to move everything to level 5. That would be ridiculous. But knowing that we have these different points can take any given scenario and figure out how important that scenario is and the extent to which we test it. And when we test it, we want to make sure that it measures up compared to the metrics the organization sets in place. So build the business case, set the metrics, test those scenarios. So wrapping up this talk, let's talk about something other than IT for a minute. Let's talk about something a little bit more old school in terms of technology. I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. The next time you're in a building and you step in an elevator, look down, just look down for a minute. Check out to see who the elevator manufacturer is. I'm willing to bet it's Otis. And if you don't know the story of the Otis elevator, you should definitely take a look at it. It's really fascinating. The namesake is Elisha Otis. Elisha Otis in the 19th century would set up platforms, go to the top of them, have crowds around him cheering, and the platform would be pulled up with a rope. And when it was at the very top of it, it would swing a sword. A sword! There's not enough swords in security. It would swing a sword, cut the rope, and he would fall, and the crowd would gasp. And at the very last minute, he would be saved by an elevator. Saved by a brake. Right? Otis Elevator succeeded by inventing the brake. And they patented it in 1913. It was that security control, the brake of the elevator, that allowed us to reach for the sky. Right? Enabling the last great migration, moving from country to city, moving from the ground floor to the sky level. All that was enabled by resiliency, by a brake. Today, we are in the midst of the next big migration where people are not necessarily moving from cities, but moving online. We're in the midst of the greatest migration in our lifetime, where we are seeing the first migration, arguably, from largely physical to virtual, everything being online. And because of that, IT resiliency has never been more important. Because of that, the brake that we're building is going to be what enables the wonders that are to come. What to do next with the information we talked today? Well, know your drivers, right? Know your strategy and the environment that you fall into. In the first 3 months, do some gap assessment and figure out what type of improvements need to happen. Figure out where your headwinds and tailwinds are, and build that business case as discussed. Now, when you build that business case and you move forward, don't just implement business continuity. Please, as you close those gaps, think about resiliency in the broader context of security, tying it in with security initiatives like we talked today, and make sure that you're testing those things regularly. Because if we don't test and we don't verify our scenarios and we don't get those outcomes, that's when things happen and suddenly those plans that we've spent so much time to put together don't actually come together and don't actually protect us. Thank you so much for joining this session. I hope you have a great RSA, and by all means, reach out with any questions or comments.